5,
4,
3,
2,
1. But who's counting, right?
And his name is Major.
Oh, ladies and gentlemen,
please welcome Major Garrett.
From the nation's capital.
Major, fantastic.
It's The Takeout.
This is a major achievement.
With CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent,
Major Garrett, yes, CBS, yes, hi.
Major Garrett.
Major, that's nonsense, and you should know better.
Is Major out of the doghouse?
The answer is yes.
Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. I'm Major Garrett. This is The Takeout. We are at Riss, one of our favorite restaurants. I'm happy and proud to say it's now a James Beard semifinalist. We don't know exactly what's going to happen with that nomination, but very happy for the good people at Riss. They have been a collaborator with the show for many, many years. We're happy for them. So, folks, you know the show loves books. You know the show loves people who write brilliant books. We have an author who's written not one, not two, not three, but 4 brilliant books. His name is Jack Farrell. He and I are contemporaries and friends. We worked together some years ago at National Journal. We were actually desk mates. He survived that. I survived that. Jack, it's great to see you.
And it's wonderful to be here. Good to see you again.
The books are Ted Kennedy, A Life, Richard Nixon, The Life. I like those compact, simple, memorable titles. Tip O'Neill and the Democratic Century, Clarence Darrow, Attorney for the Damned. Jack, I want to ask you, do you think there is a city in America more central to the politics of our country than Boston?
Well, you have to. If you start going back to the Adamses and the Revolution, the abolitionist movement, progressive movement, I'm not sure that Boston was as important as Chicago was in the labor movement. But then definitely you have that amazing string of presidential candidates coming out in the post-war eras. Yeah, that's Austin and Boston.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me, going back to that origin story of America and then running through speakerships, significant players in almost every key debate, Boston is there. And the topic of one of your books, Edward M. Kennedy, a product of Boston, his family is a product of Boston, all of that flows through, but not just through Kennedy, John Kerry, John McCormick,
Michael
Dukakis, and Boston, and how you become a skilled local politician often is a springboard to becoming a successful national politician. That which you learn locally, you apply nationally.
Yeah. As Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. Part of that, I think, is that I'm a New Yorker.
Mm-hmm. But you worked at the Boston Globe for many years.
But I worked at the Globe for many years. So I saw the different ethnic mix in both cities. In New York, there's Puerto Ricans, there's blacks, there's Italians, there's Germans, there's Jews, there's the Irish. In Boston, there's only the old Brahmin WASPs and the Irish immigrants.
The Protestant hierarchy and the Irish immigrants.
And that, I think, put a lot of pressure on both sides to play politics very well, because the Brahmins were gradually being overwhelmed by this tide of immigrants. For the Irish, it was the way to sink their teeth into the New World, and for the Brahmins, it was a way to keep them out. And so politics was fought at a very high level and a very low level at the same time for many, many years. And I think that tradition goes on and on.
Blood sport is not too strong a word.
What?
Blood sport.
No. The Kennedys, I think, sort of fueled a new generation of that, because in addition to the blood sport, they also inspired. I don't want to make it sound like it's all just, a power grabbing, but they also inspired, younger generations of people like the Michael Dukakises and John Kerrys of the world who maintained the tradition.
Mm-hmm. So the book, Ted Kennedy, A Life, Richard Nixon, The Life, the Nixon book, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. The Ted Kennedy book was long-listed for the National Book Award, very, very well received. I want to ask you a couple of questions about the connection between the two.
Between prizes and
work? Between Nixon and Kennedy, and the
fine.
Kennedys. Yeah. Nixon, of course, runs for president in 1960, loses to John F. Kennedy. Nixon's obsessed with Edward M. Kennedy in 1968 and through his presidency. What are some of the more fascinating components of that interaction through that period of time in American history?
Number one, John Kennedy and Richard Nixon both entered the post-war Congress, the House of Representatives, in 1946 and became good friends. Mm-hmm. They both respected each other's depth of knowledge, and especially in foreign affairs. And Nixon sort of had an idolatry for Jack Kennedy, who was handsomer and slicker and had more women. Dick Nixon had already gotten married to Pat Nixon, who was the amazing revolution of my book on Nixon. I mean, what a wonderful, fantastic person she was. So that's number one, is that they started out as good friends. And that made number two even more significant, which is that in 1960, Nixon is persuaded that the Kennedys stole the election from him. And it's a double betrayal because of that, because he was good friends with the Kennedys and he thought that he deserved better. And that leads then to number three, which is that when Nixon becomes president of the United States, he is totally paranoid about Edward Kennedy and what the lingering
and the Kennedy mystique
and the Kennedy mafioso and what they were going to do to him. And in a large extent, that can explain some of the decisions he made launching his dirty tricks guys in the Watergate scandal. So three big instances.
And I want to zero in on 1960 and that idea that the election possibly was stolen. There were those who were advocating for Richard Nixon to contest it.
Yeah.
Grand juries were impaneled to investigate. And there was evidence, far more evidence than there ever was in 2020. I've done quite a bit of reading on this. But Nixon didn't. Nixon said, no, look, for the betterment of the country, for the betterment of the Constitution, this is not a road I intend to go down. And I will not go, and I will suppress and reject any efforts to do this. But he still believed it? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. And I had Julie Nixon actually told me once that he was never the same after 1960, and that there was a line there to what happened, the tragedy, what happened in Watergate. Looking back, I would say that you can make a very good argument that Texas was stolen, although the margin of votes was bigger there.
Gino was here. He's brought our lunch. That's great. That's what happens here at RIST. Chicken Milanese, my go-to. Everyone knows that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gino. Thank you.
In Illinois, the margin was much closer, but that was more thoroughly investigated and by a Republican state's attorney, a little bit more dubious. But then you have to ask yourself, okay, the first thing that the Kennedys did was put Ted Kennedy on a plane to go back to California and see about why, and this has great resonance in what's happened lately, why all of a sudden Kennedy's lead had disappeared in
California.
In California, and the historic answer, and probably the answer, is that the Republicans outgamed them in Southern California with the absentee ballots. But the pro-Nixon margin on the absentee ballots was twice as much as the margin in the regular election, the popular vote, which Kennedy had won. So you might have had all three of those states in a big, nasty battle if it had continued. So there was some uncertainty there. But having said all that, yes, Richard Nixon was absolutely noble in the way he conducted himself in a very testing and disappointing time. Yeah.
And, of course, as the sitting vice president, had to preside.
And he had to preside, and he did so with great dignity. You can watch that today. Somehow, Nixon, who had no sense of humor and was very bad at telling jokes, got through that with a very winning smile and a sincerity that did him a lot of good. People remembered that.
That's a really important
as opposed to 1962 when he lost the governorship of California. And
so you won't have Dick Nixon in the car kicking around anymore. Right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Some of that grace and some of that forbearance in the face of defeat, somehow it slipped away.
Yeah.
That happens in politics. We're going to go to a break here in a second, Jack, but when you started your work on the Edward M. Kennedy biography, what were you most curious about finding?
Major, I had covered the guy. You had covered the guy. He had such an outstanding and gigantic personality that, you always say, well, what's the real guy like?
Right.
And that's what I wanted to try to find out. And I had some suspicions because I had covered him in good times and bad times, but I was stunned, absolutely flabbergasted as I did the work at the picture of who the real Ted Kennedy was. He was not a confident Kennedy. He was a person who was plagued by self-doubt and self-sabotage.
We will get to both self-doubt and self-sabotage when we come back. Jack Farrell's our guest. RISK is our host restaurant. Back for segment 2 of the Takeout in just 1 second.
He was like a shark, a great white shark, who always had to keep moving because if sharks stop moving, they drown.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome back. Jack Farrell is our guest. Rist is our host restaurant. We're going to talk about Ted Kennedy in the book, Ted Kennedy, A Life. We also talked a little bit about Richard Nixon, the book, Richard Nixon, The Life. I really love those compact titles. Easy for me to remember.
Tip O'Neill in the Democratic Century,
Right.
and then it was Clarence Darrow, attorney for the Dam, and then it was Richard Nixon, The Life. By the time I get to the next one, it's just going to be, like Frank.
Right. Exactly. Self-doubt and self-sabotage.
Yeah. He was the ninth child of absentee parents. And for all the ability that Joseph Kennedy, the dad, had at manufacturing these Life magazine and early television photographs and film of the Kennedys at play, playing touch football, this amazing, toothy, wonderful athletic family, it was in many ways a lie, and that there was great connection between the kids, but not so much between the parents and the kids. And by the time Ted came along, and he was the ninth, Rose says it in her diary, is that, it's kind of hard to go out there on the ski slope and tell the ninth kid that he's doing a great job when you've done it for 8. It's kind of hard to read those stories at night. And so he was shipped away to boarding school at the age of 7 and bounced around to like 13 different schools before he finally entered Harvard, where he flamed out and was, after a year, and was ejected for a cheating scandal. So this is a guy who all along looked at these 3 older brothers he had, all of whom died young at the moment of their greatest potential.
Yep.
And said to himself, there's no way I can match these people. And he was doomed or blessed with the notion that he had to carry the Kennedy banner on through time, encountering many of the disasters that would have befallen somebody like John Kennedy had he gone on and lived a longer life, but they all fell on Ted instead. So there's a great amount of sorrow, there's a great amount of inner torment, a great amount of unresolved grief, all of which resulted in 2 things. One was a personal life, which was disastrous, but the other was using work as an anodyne. Which is work. If I work all the time, I can't be that bad a guy. And that gave him a tremendous amount of energy, which, combined with other blessings that he had that we can talk about, made him the so-called Lion of the Senate.
And that idea of working really hard and then playing really hard seems to me sewn into the Kennedy mystique.
It is. At one point I wrote a story after there was a first great scandal, of course, was Chappaquiddick. The second was the Palm Beach rape trial of his nephew in 1991. And I wrote a story at that point as a reporter for the Boston Globe covering him, saying that he was like a shark, a great white shark, who always had to keep moving because if sharks stop moving, they drown. And I said, he's like a great white shark, and if he ever stops moving, he's going to drown in grief and sorrow. And he sent me a little note and signed it with a little caricature of a shark, and he wrote Ted the Shark, which was, I think, the closest thing to a confirmation that he was ever going to give to me that it was on the right track then. And I did not find that note until about halfway through my research on the book. I was going through my own old files, and there it was, and that gave me an impetus that this was the right direction I was on.
And in the book, you have diaries that are telling about history that was not known until you came across them, correct?
Yeah, 2 kinds of diaries. First are his own, which are very comprehensive, but the ones I managed to get a hold of were just segments that were included by mistake in files in the National Archives. But they're very revealing. At one point, he is, for example, he's interviewing Chief Justice Roberts, who's aspiring to become Chief Justice of the United States. And in his diary, Kennedy remarks how frustrated he was trying to make a connection. Roberts had an Irish connection. Roberts had a Catholic connection. Kennedy really thought he could reach across, and he couldn't. He couldn't make that connection because Roberts is a very smart guy and was sort of reserved and didn't want to get into this. But at one point, finally, Ted Kennedy says to Justice Roberts, "Okay, I see American history as a continuum. Privileged white males, all white males, blacks, women, gay liberation. You can be on the side of increased liberty and freedom, or you can be part of the counterattack, and that's going to be up to you." And Roberts does not answer that, but it sort of is the great leading question of today's Supreme Court. But it also indicates, I think, what Teddy thought his role in political life, America's political history was, which was to maintain that continuum. The other diaries I got were Arthur Schlesinger, who was the House historian in the John Kennedy White House, very close friends with Gene Kennedy Smith and Steve Smith and Ted Kennedy. So Arthur shows up at Hyannisport in the week after Chappaquiddick, in which a young aide, Mary Jo Kopechne, drowned in Ted Kennedy's car. And I think that there's very few people in America who don't know what happened. That Ted and Mary Jo went out for a drive, probably to the beach, for whether romantic or just a consoling moment, we'll never know. And then we suspect that Ted immediately realized what a disaster this was and tried to save his political career, which was something that he always insisted he didn't do. Now we have in these diaries, these Schlesinger diaries, him recounting what Ted Kennedy told his family in the hours after Chappaquiddick, which was, I had had 3 drinks. All I could think about was, what a screw-up I am and what this does to the family name, and how am I going to tell her parents, my wife, that this happened, and that he resolved to try to cover it up as best he could in those hours. And part of that was leaving the poor girl in his car overnight, which is something that his mother never forgave him for.
Right.
Yeah.
It is the part of Ted Kennedy's life I think any fair-minded person finds the most repellent.
I use the word craven, and I think it's one of the longest entries in the index, and yet the criticism for the book has been that I didn't cut the guy's head off and put it on a spike on the city gates. It was like I tried to. I think biography has to be empathetic first of all, for no matter who your character is, whether it's Richard Nixon or Ted Kennedy. This is not a political exercise where you're either building one of these guys up or tearing them down because it's
meaning
empathetic
because
team.
if you're not, you can't hope to understand them.
And you have to try to understand them. I think people want, but the only good reason for a biography is for people to understand the human condition, and you really don't understand the human condition unless you bring empathy to the subject and try to explain why he felt the way that he did, whether it's Nixon or Kennedy, I think. Yeah.
And, of course, Chappaquiddick became that which separated Ted Kennedy from the White House.
Definitely. And it was a...
Justifiably.
Absolutely. And it was... what's amazing for political junkies is how the Kennedy people deluded themselves into thinking that this was not...
Wouldn't.
We're talking about a time when there's 30,000 nuclear warheads pointed, across the oceans at 3 different countries. And we're talking about putting somebody in the Oval Office who admitted in his mea culpa speech that he suffered from panic and terror and fear and disorientation. And, the obvious question is, okay, so, Mr. President Kennedy, President Ted, there's 10,000 Russian missiles crossing the North Pole right now. What do you do? And that question was not put effectively until he challenged Jimmy Carter in 1979 and 80. And Carter's team used that quite effectively. And the press, this is the post-Watergate press. They're feeling a little bit beaten up as being, pro-Republican. They're going to say, well, we're going to treat Teddy as rigorously as we treated Dick. And it was easily the reason why he lost. Now, there are other reasons, too. The Iranian hostage crisis.
Yes, right.
Gave Carter the ability to play the Rose Garden strategy.
But this scrappy upstart network known as CBS played a role in Ted Kennedy's life in 1979 and 1980 through the good offices of one Roger Mudd. We're going to talk about that with Jack Farrell. When we come back, I'm Major Garrett. Riss, our host restaurant. Jack's going to get a chance to eat, I promise you, ladies and gentlemen. Back for segment 3 in just 1 second.
And if you follow his career, the closer he gets to the Oval Office, the worse he performs. And the further away from it he is, the better he performs.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome back. Jack Farrell's our guest. Let me tell you a little bit about the way he writes. He writes with clarity. He writes with great verve. And he doesn't waste words. He really is a brilliant writer, and I love spending time with his books. So, Jack, I'm glad you're with us.
In interviews, I can waste words. But not,
Yeah, waste all the words you want here. Exactly.
On the page, I try not to.
Exactly.
Yeah. But with a person like Teddy Kennedy, whose life is so operatic.
Right.
I mean, the challenge is to be Danish modern and just like whittle it down,
and not be beguiled by the mystique and all the other things. But let's go back to Roger Mudd, CBS, and this upstart, scrappy little network, CBS, in 1979. Look, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't know what I'm referring to, ironically, is that the concentrated power of American news media, particularly the broadcast networks, was far and away greater then than it is now. We are fractionally as powerful as we were then. It's just a fact. And I'm not saying it's a good or bad fact, it's just a fact.
Yep.
And the power of broadcast television in that era was enormous, and it was concentrated, held by a very small number of people. Roger Mudd was a correspondent, revered, justifiably revered. He's one of my heroes. And he talked to Ted Kennedy. Carry on with that story.
Well, the interview is scheduled for Hyannisport.
And this is about the presidential campaign.
Yeah, this is in August or early September of 1979. Everybody knows he's a candidate. It hasn't been formally announced yet. That's not going to happen until November because he wants Jimmy Carter to come and dedicate the Kennedy Library to his brother in Boston.
Before he sticks a shiv in the back and says,
yes,
"I'm
exactly.
running against you."
Yeah, right. But it was no surprise to anybody. And Carter was was way down in the depths at this point.
Mm-hmm.
This was before the Iranian hostage crisis gave him the opportunity to play the Rose Garden strategy and come roaring back on a tide of patriotic sympathy. Right. So Ted sits there, and one thing about Ted Kennedy is that he was so insecure about his own gifts that he was constantly rehearsing, constantly practicing before any big event. And inexplicably, for some reason, we can get to a very interesting theory as to why, he doesn't rehearse for this particular event. And Roger Mudd asks him a series of really softball questions, but also, some questions like, as you mentioned during the break, what's the status of your marriage? Any politician who's thinking about running for president should have a state answer to that, and the answer is, we have some times which are, we hope that just totally caught unprepared. So that's over.
A flashing red light,
Yeah.
Things are really bad, and all the terrible things you've heard about me or read about me in the gossip columns are probably true.
Yeah, right. And I can't even come up with a
plausible way of denying it.
Exactly.
On my own behalf, on my own steam.
Yep. So that's over, and the second interview is scheduled for his office. Now,
In Washington, D.C.
In Washington, D.C., Teddy's got a coat and a tie on. He's prepared. He's rehearsed. He's prepared. He's rehearsed. He's ready for Roger Mudd. Mudd comes in and, whether wants to give him a break or not, asks him the biggest softball in American political history. Why do you want to be president? And Ted Kennedy goes, this country, we have many resources, and and just bungles that question. Well, that immediately raises the question of, was there
What the hell is going on?
Lots of people who loved him immediately said, this is self-sabotage. This is him. He doesn't want it. He's
lighting himself on fire, metaphorically, on national television.
Right. Yeah. And that's and if you follow his career, the closer he gets to the Oval Office, the worse he performs. And the further away from it he is, the better he performs. Classically, the speech at the convention in 1980,
Right.
with the "Dream Will Never Die" speech, he's lost, right?
Right.
This is, they lost the night before.
Yep.
So now he's not going to be president, and all of a sudden he's great.
Which I think leads me to that unified theory you were suggesting a moment ago, that this is really what it's about.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and it wasn't just me. I mean, this
Yeah.
family intimates like Ellen Goodman and of the Boston Globe and Anthony Lewis, the New York Times, both had columns about this immediately. Senator Warren Rudman of New Hampshire watched that, and picked up the phone and said, what the hell is going on here? This is a guy who doesn't want to be president.
Doesn't want to be president. Fundamentally.
Yeah. Does not think that he can ever match up to those three Golden brothers, but especially to Jack and Bobby.
Right. Do you have any idea, Jack Farrell, what kind of president he might have been? You ever wonder about that?
Yeah, I think he would have been capable. I think he certainly would have rallied. It would have been a great liberal presidency. He would have rallied the liberal cause. They still had presumably he would have beaten Ronald Reagan to get to the White House, and that they would still have a Democratic Congress, and that the great conservative revolution would not have happened. But the great political sin of his life, and to some extent Jimmy Carter's life, is how they let the personal become political, or the political become the personal. These are two guys who could not make up, could not get together. I think Teddy deserves the blame more than Carter, because Kennedy knew that he wasn't going to win, and he should have folded his tent that spring, let Carter have the unifying convention. I think they, as everybody always did, they underestimated Ronald Reagan and thought this wouldn't matter, and it did matter. It mattered a lot.
It mattered a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that could be said, fairly or unfairly, of President Carter is that he inspired a lot of people to get involved in politics. The problem for the Democratic Party is most of them were conservative Republicans.
That's true. That was, I'm one of them. I'm not a conservative Republican, but I look back at that vote for Reagan in 1980. It was like one of a shining, proud moment of my
young life,
election booth life.
Yeah. Does it matter how formidable and successful Ted Kennedy was as a legislator?
I think so. I mean, one of the great lessons of Ted Kennedy's legislative record is how you have to keep maintaining the fight. Because here's an example. After Watergate, Ted Kennedy, as he was so skilled at doing, reaches across the alley. He gets the aisle. He gets the Minority Leader Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania to go with him on a big campaign finance reform bill. The New York Times reports the passage of this bill as a bill that, believe it or not, will forever end the influence of big money in American politics, right?
Yeah.
Front page of the New York Times.
Didn't age well, kids. Did not age well.
And over time, that bill has been whittled and riddled until it's till right now you've got billionaires contributing hundreds of millions of dollars, and we don't even know who they are that are buying our elections. So that's an example of how you have to be careful when you rate a senator or a congressman, because all these things can be weathered by time and by the opposition. The Affordable Care Act, John McCain walking onto the floor, is a great political moment that sort of summarizes that up. That said, Ted Kennedy, always with a Republican sponsor for this demon of the right, always managed to find somebody like Bob Dole, George W. Bush, Ronald Reagan,
Orrin Hatch,
Richard Nixon, John McCain, Alan Simpson, Howard Baker. You cannot name a Republican leader of the last 25 years of the 20th century that did not put his name on a major monumental act of legislation with Ted Kennedy. And some of them were like, they can bring you to tears. The like you said, the friendship and the alliance with Orrin Hatch resulted in this amazing moment on the Senate floor. They're pushing for historic AIDS legislation at the time of the AIDS crisis. And Jesse Helms stands up, and all he wants to do is blame the homosexuals for their own behavior. They brought this upon us. And Orrin Hatch stands up and gives, you can see it on C-SPAN, and it is worth finding, and gives this amazing speech in which he says, I cannot read what is in people's hearts. There are good people and there are bad people, but I know that this is a public health crisis and that these people deserve better than what this Congress has given them. And we're going to pass this bill and provide help for the AIDS epidemic.
And overcome
in America.
Jesse Helms' obstruction.
And overcome Jesse Helms, yeah. Republican against Republican, but the partner on that bill was a great partnership, Hatch and Kennedy.
And as I recall, there was one moment where I can't remember who said it to whom, but Either Ted sent it to Orrin or Orrin sent it to Ted. I'll come to your state, and I'll campaign for you or against you, whatever works best.
Whatever works best. I think it probably would work both ways if you think about Utah and Massachusetts. But then they went on, and like the next year with Bob Dole, again, another conservative, they passed the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Yes, exactly.
It's stunning what they could do, reaching across the aisle
And
in ways that
putting
unimaginable today.
heads, hearts, and pen together. Major Garrett is my name. Jack Farrell, that's his name. Riss is our restaurant. Segment 4 coming your way in just a second.
It really was the start of the culture battle in America.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome back. We've waded through Richard Nixon, Edward M. Kennedy, a lot of other parts and names and events in that era of American history. Let's do a little bit something different. You've written about Clarence Darrow.
Yes.
Attorney for the damned. Let's just spend 8 or 9 minutes with Clarence Darrow.
Oh, I'd love to do that.
Why-
the most ignored of my books.
Yeah. Why was he an attorney for the damned?
Darrow was a true small p populist and small l liberal in the years after the Civil War, as the Gilded Age came upon the United States.
The great machinery of the Industrial Revolution transformed American economics, culture, and politics.
Exactly. And squashed the little guy.
Yep.
And Clarence Darrow was a little guy, came from a small town, Ohio, and it drove him crazy. And so he built a career, first as a labor lawyer, and then as a criminal defense lawyer, trying to represent the little guy, giving the little guy a stake when the odds were against him. Henceforth, attorney for the damned.
There's a movie about one aspect of his life. It's called Inherit the Wind. It's one of my favorite movies. Spencer Tracy portrays Clarence Darrow. What do you think of that movie and the way that handles the Scopes trial?
It's, we talked about Chappaquiddick.
Yeah.
That movie is a very good movie about Chappaquiddick. The movie Chappaquiddick is a very good movie about the incident of Chappaquiddick. And Inherit the Wind is a very good, it's a little, slightly over-exaggerated.
Right. It's a little hyped, but not by Hollywood standards.
No, and it cops out a little bit at the end where Spencer Tracy throws Darwin and the Bible together in his suitcase. Darrow never would have done that. He never would have taken the Bible home. But no, it's an excellent, and that's what most people think of when they think of Clarence Darrow.
Right.
Is
They
the
think of
monkey
Spencer
trial.
Tracy. Yes, right.
Now, with the interesting thing, and I think we might have talked
And
about
a
this.
fascinating turn acting-wise for Gene Kelly in that movie.
Yes.
Not a
yes.
role you would ordinarily expect him to portray.
And you almost he played Mencken.
Yes.
The ultimately cynical journalist, and you almost expect him to be tap dancing, like
I keep waiting for him to break out in song and dance.
Right. But yes, an excellent performance too. Because, but we talked a little bit about this before when we went on the air. Is it really was the start of the culture battle in America, because what you had was the sophisticated city folks believing in things like Einstein's theory of relativity, and the folks out in the countryside
and
who were
evolution.
And evolution, of course, was the great turning point about that battle. And I would say that the next big step in the culture battle was then Joe McCarthy and Richard Nixon and the anti-communist movement right after World War II, and that then leads us directly to where we are today.
Lesser known, but an important case in Clarence Darrow's life, Leopold and Loeb.
Yeah.
Thrill killers, and when that terminology was utterly alien to the American lexicon.
Yes, and they were homosexuals. They were rich. They were of Jewish descent, and they took a little 12-year-old kid off the streets and killed him just for the thrill of it, just to see if they could do it. And this was a case that nobody was ever going to save them from the gallows, and only Clarence Darrow, with a 3-day closing argument, managed it, or at least created an atmosphere in the public mind that the judge would not have been immediately taken out and hanged himself if he gave them life imprisonment, which is what he did.
Yeah. He saved them from the gallows.
He did. The thing about Clarence Darrow is that he doesn't get any of these famous cases. He doesn't get them off free. They don't walk out.
Right.
But he saves them all from the death penalty. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that movie,
Another great movie. Compulsion. Yeah.
Well, yes, and that story is somewhat fictionalized in the Alfred Hitchcock movie Rope.
Oh, yep, as well.
Elitists who think they're smarter than the wreck around them.
And they absolutely were.
Yes.
Absolutely were. Yeah.
And that's keeping with Leopold and Loeb.
Evil, not people you'd want to have lunch with at Reese. Yeah.
No. Is that somehow a checkered part of Clarence Darrow's history, taking up for suspects and criminals and ne'er-do-wells and thrill killers like that?
Only at the very end. I think at the very end, after the great crash of the 1920s, he took a case in Hawaii, which was a revenge case in which a bunch of white sailors went out and beat up and killed a native Hawaiian who they accused of having raped a young white girl. And he took the case not of the native Hawaiian, but of the
assailants,
rich Southern sailors. So in that case, and when asked about it, he was candid enough to say, I needed the money, and it was a rich family, and I did it. So that's like the great blot on his record is that one. But also the case that ended his career as a labor lawyer was a labor case from a labor terrorist blew up the Los Angeles Times in Los Angeles. And Darrow defended this terrorist and his brother, who was a leading official in the labor movement, thinking that this was American industry, using this as a way to crack down on this is in the 1910s, so on the then still aborting American labor movement. And the pressure was on him to such an extent that it's been argued that he tried to bribe the jury. In my book, I come down with my judgment, it was that he did try to bribe the jury.
Really?
It's not accepted by everyone, but he was so desperate, so
desperate for a win?
Not so much to win, just to save their lives, which is what he did. They didn't walk. He just
they were convicted, but
saved them from the gallows. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So is that the through line for him, saving people from death at the hands of the state?
Yeah. I mean, he saw the state. He saw anything big as almost inherently evil. It's very hard to pin him down as a liberal. You certainly can't pin him down as a Republican or a Democrat.
Right.
Although he did once try to get the Democratic nomination for the presidency. But he was basically a libertarian in a way that doesn't really apply today when we have a libertarian party that doesn't even believe in parking meters. But in his day, to be libertarian meant that you believed in free love on one hand, and on the other hand, you believed that the forces of industry were crushing the little guy.
Look, I think there is something, and we'll end on this note, comparable in the Gilded Age and we are now experiencing the digital age. It creates a great sense of anxiety and fear because this does look monstrous and scary, the implications of the industrial age and the digital age, and it leaves people unmoored.
Definitely. Most definitely.
And Darrow was like, I'm against this.
Yes, and I think it's also the great failure of the Democratic Party and the Tip O'Neill and the Ted Kennedy era as well, was that they really came up with no solutions for globalization and the amazing shift in American business from manufacturing to finance. No real answers. They had palliatives, like
and they weren't good enough. And then there was Donald Trump.
Exactly.
And we will end it there. Jack Farrell, great pleasure. Thank you, sir.
My pleasure.
Thanks to Riss for hosting us. Your Takeout Outtake Especial. That's coming up next. Stay tuned.
Well, right now, I'm listening to a lot of the Avett Brothers, which is my one claim to being with it and hip.
We all need at least one.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. You know who I am. Major Garrett, always, every week. That's how it works. Gino, thank you so much for the coffee. Jack Farrell's our guest. Jack, you may or may not know this. We ask every single guest who sits down with us here at the Takeout 3. We like to call them threshold questions.
Shoot.
You may not think they're threshold, but I do. Most influential book in your life and why? all-time favorite movie, and if you're on a long flight or a long drive, what kind of music, artist, or genre are you most likely to listen to?
Okay, so first one was
Book.
Influential. All the King's Men.
About? I know the answer, but I want my audience to know.
About Huey Long, but also about the trade-offs at the heart of politics, which is ends versus means. How do you represent the little guy if corruption is the only way that you can build a machine to do so?
What is the cost of corruption, human and external?
Yeah.
Internal and
Yes,
external.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Fantastic book. I read it every 10 years or so. For writing, I read poetry. I especially read William Butler Yeats. Before I'm actually, or in the process of writing, I want to get those rhythms in my head.
Hard to get better than that.
Yeah.
Really hard to get better than that. Do you find poetry relaxing or taxing?
The kind of poetry I like, which is, older and more traditional, I find relaxing. Not all poetry is. It's like music. Some music is set there to agitate you, and others is to soothe you.
Exactly. One of your favorite movies, or your all-time favorite movie?
Chinatown. Again,
a great movie.
Again, a story of corruption and human nature.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think there's a bad note in it.
No,
there
really isn't.
Also love a little movie that your listeners may have heard of called Local Hero. About a oil company executive who goes to a small town in Scotland to try to buy the oil rights to their land, and is so enchanted with small town life and these amazing characters that the directors and the actors draw, that he's challenged and has to look at himself in the mirror and say, what is my life all about? But it's a comedy. It's very, very good.
Very good. So about Chinatown, someone you know well, Ron Brownstein, was on the show about his book, Rock Me on the Water.
Terrific book. Yeah.
Fantastic book about that culmination in the early 70s of creative energy in Los Angeles. Mentions Chinatown at great length. I recommend the movie, that book, and everything that Jack Farrell's ever written. Chinatown is one of the great movies of all time. Robert Towne's the screenwriter. That screenplay is used in most classes of a high end to teach the basics of screenwriting for all the right reasons. What kind of music do you like?
I'm sort of on the rock and roll side. I'm more on the roll side than the rock. So
explain yourself, Jack Farrell.
Right now, I'm listening to a lot of the Avett Brothers, which is my one claim to being with it and hip.
We all need at least one.
We went to see Los Lobos the other night.
Okay.
Great Mexican-American band.
From the 80s and 90s.
Touring
Yes, kids, look them up.
Touring for 50 years.
Yeah.
They're still out there. And they're not in the Hall of Fame. And
need to be.
We know why.
Need to be. Fix that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cleveland.
But really, one of the great moments of the last couple of years was watching that wonderful Peter Jackson documentary on the Beatles making the movie Let It Be, and reminding how much I love their music.
So let me ask you, if you had to rank them in order, 1 to 4, please rank for me the Beatles, the Stones, the Who, and Led Zeppelin.
Well, I'd put the Grateful Dead up there too.
Oh God! You've already failed. All right, whatever.
All right, I think the Beatles have to be 1, and
they have to be.
The Stones have to be 2.
Okay.
And I think there's a whole bunch of people that you could put in there for number
3,
3, and 4. Yeah,
but you wouldn't put necessarily the Who or Led Zeppelin there.
I listened to Tommy until I wore out the grooves, and I still probably. I'm still
clearly
wondering,
not a Led Zeppelin.
Still
fan,
wondering
clearly.
what the lyrics are for Stairway to Heaven. What exactly does that mean?
There's a bustle in your hedgerow. Don't be alarmed now. It's just a sprinkling for the May Queen. Come on, what's your problem?
Can you turn this on you? How would you rank them?
Zeppelin.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
I think, and I won't go into this. I've done it many times. I think they're the most influential through the continuation of rock and roll. Yes, they took American blues. In some cases, they stole from American blues without proper attribution. I always say that about Led Zeppelin. I never leave that out. But their sound and their orientation has been more inspirational to more drummers, more guitar players, and has a longer run through Nirvana, through Nine Inch Nails, through so many other rock bands that have been successful on their own terms since then. I rate them number 1. Then the Stones, then the Who, then the Beatles. I put the Beatles 4th. I really do.
Okay, well, we can wrestle
off camera on that. Jack Farrell, it's been a pleasure. This has been your Takeout Outtake Especial, folks, and a little bit of Major's musical waywardness. See you next week.